Recovered Guild Expedition Report. Status: unresolved. Begin record.
There are monsters that roar loud enough to shake mountains, and monsters that leave villages burned to ash. Hunters prepare for those. Steel can meet claws. Courage can meet rage. But there is another kind of predator whispered about by caravan guards and overworked researchers. One that never charges through the front gate because it has already slipped into the only place no hunter can defend. They say you do not realize you have been hunted until sleeping becomes something you fear more than death. At first, the dreams are strange. Then they become familiar. Then they become memories of places you have never been. By the time the creature finally looks directly into your eyes, you have already lost more than sleep. You have become prey. If the old records are to be believed, there exists a malformed Malfestio, unlike any officially documented specimen. It does not rely on confusion spores or hypnotic tricks alone. It marks a single victim, follows them through every night, and patiently feeds on exhaustion until reality itself becomes fragile enough for the hunt to end. Hunters who tracked it gave the creature a name that never appeared in the guild's bestiaries, because they refused to believe it belonged beside ordinary monsters. They called it the Preyseeker. The following account comes from fragmented field journals recovered from an abandoned observation lodge near the frontier. Most of the pages are water damaged. Several are torn away entirely, and the final entries appear to have been written by someone who had forgotten how long they had been awake. Guild archivists dismissed the writings as delirium caused by prolonged isolation. What made the journals difficult to ignore was not the writing itself. It was the hunting party sent to retrieve the missing observer. They found no signs of struggle, no blood, no damaged walls, and no footprints leading away from the cabin except the observer's own. His bed was still warm. The lantern remained lit. The journal rested open beside the pillow, ending in the middle of a sentence. Every member of that recovery team reportedly requested reassignment after returning to civilization. None of them would explain why. The observer's first entry described little more than poor sleep. He blamed the mountain winds and the constant calls of ordinary Malfestio nesting nearby. He noted hearing wings brushing against the roof after sunset. Though inspections every morning revealed nothing unusual, it was irritating but hardly alarming. Hunters stationed alone often imagine sounds after weeks in the wilderness. The first nightmare arrived on the third night. He dreamed he was standing in the middle of a dense forest beneath a moon far larger than it should have been. Every tree leaned inward as though listening. Somewhere overhead, an owl called exactly once. The sound echoed for far longer than it should have, repeating itself until it became impossible to tell whether the cry was growing closer or simply louder. When he woke, the dream lingered with unusual clarity. He remembered individual leaves on the trees. He remembered the smell of damp bark. Most disturbing of all, he remembered the feeling of being watched despite never seeing another living creature. Even after daylight filled the cabin, he could not shake the certainty that something had been standing just outside the edge of his vision. The second nightmare changed only slightly. The same forest waited beneath the swollen moon. The same silence stretched between the trees. This time, he noticed feathers scattered across the ground. They were impossibly dark, absorbing the moonlight instead of reflecting it. Each step crushed them with a sound resembling dry bones snapping beneath his boots. Again, the owl called once. Again, he woke before finding its source. He laughed the dream away while writing the entry. He joked that spending too much time studying nocturnal monsters had finally invaded his subconscious. Yet later that afternoon, he admitted forgetting simple measurements during routine observations. He found himself rereading the same page several times without understanding the words. Fatigue settled into his thoughts like wet cloth. The nightmares continued every night. Each dream began exactly where the last had ended, as though sleep were not creating new experiences, but returning him to an existing place. The forest gradually revealed itself with impossible consistency. Moss grew over broken stones in precisely the same patterns. Twisted branches stretched across the path in familiar shapes. Even the cold breeze always arrived from the same direction. Then the eyes appeared. They reflected high above him between overlapping branches, two golden circles suspended in absolute darkness. Whenever he looked directly toward them, they disappeared. Whenever he looked away, he felt them returning. The sensation was unbearable because it carried none of the uncertainty found in ordinary fear. He knew something watched him. He simply was not allowed to see it. By the seventh day, he admitted sleeping had become an obligation rather than rest. Every morning, he woke more exhausted than the night before. Coffee lost its effect. Herbal tonics dulled headaches for only minutes. His handwriting deteriorated into cramped, uneven scratches across the page. Several sentences repeated themselves without his noticing until much later. The observer reported seeing shadows moving incorrectly during daylight. Birds perched on branches with their heads turned far beyond what should have been physically possible. Tree hollows resembled open eyes whenever he passed them. More than once he instinctively stepped aside because he believed something had swooped overhead, only to realize the sky above him remained perfectly empty. He still refused to abandon the lodge. Professional pride can become a dangerous thing in isolated places. He believed recording every symptom would help future researchers understand whatever illness had taken hold. Even when common sense demanded retreat, curiosity convinced him to remain. He insisted nightmares alone could not justify abandoning an assignment. The eighth dream finally revealed the hunter. It stood silently on a branch overlooking the path. Its body resembled a Malfestio, but every familiar feature had become subtly wrong. The plumage appeared stretched unnaturally thin, leaving gaps where darkness showed beneath the feathers, like exposed flesh beneath torn clothing. Its face retained the broad owl-like disc, characteristic of the species, yet the markings twisted inward to resemble a permanent expression of quiet amusement. Its eyes never blinked. The observer wrote that the creature did not attack. It merely watched as though confirming something. Then it slowly rotated its head farther and farther until it faced him, despite its body still pointing away. No ordinary animal should have been capable of that movement. He awoke gasping before the monster spread its wings. From that morning onward, every mirror in the cabin disturbed him. He repeatedly caught glimpses of movement behind his reflection. Each time he turned around, nothing stood there. Sometimes the reflection itself seemed delayed by a fraction of a second. Sometimes he could have sworn his own eyes remained fixed on the mirror after he had already looked away. Rational explanations became harder to accept with every sleepless night. His journal mentioned hearing scratching beneath the floorboards after sunset. The sounds always ceased when he reached for a lantern. They resumed only after he returned to bed. Eventually, he stopped investigating altogether because walking through the dark cabin demanded more energy than he possessed. He had become too tired to be afraid properly, and somehow that frightened him even more. The dreams no longer began in the forest. Now they began inside the cabin itself. He dreamed of waking in his own bed exactly as he had every previous morning. The lantern burned beside him. The fireplace glowed faintly. Everything appeared normal until he noticed the window standing open despite remembering it locked before sleeping. Cold mountain air drifted through the room, carrying loose feathers that settled silently across the floor. Outside waited the forest. Not beyond the cabin, around it. The observer would approach the doorway, believing escape remained possible, only to discover the mountain trail gone entirely. Trees stood where open ground should have been, packed shoulder to shoulder until their trunks resembled prison bars. Somewhere among them, something clicked its beak once. Every dream ended with that sound. The journal entries became increasingly fragmented. He described losing minutes during ordinary conversations with passing merchants. He forgot names of colleagues he had known for years. Meals remained untouched because he could not remember preparing them. Twice he awoke standing outside the cabin after sunset with no memory of leaving his bed. He finally attempted to return to civilization. According to the journal, he packed supplies before dawn, saddled his pack animal, and followed the mountain road downhill. By evening, he reached another cabin, identical to his own. The same lantern hung beside the same crooked door. Inside waited his own journal, resting open upon the table, already containing the words describing his arrival. The following page simply read, "I think it wants me tired enough to stop questioning impossible things." Guild researchers later dismissed that passage as obvious evidence of sleep deprivation hallucinations. They may have been correct. That explanation becomes harder to accept after reading what followed. The observer realized the creature was changing with every dream. At first he had seen only distant eyes, then a silhouette, then details of feathers and claws. Now he could distinguish tiny imperfections across its face. One side of the beak carried a pale fracture. Several feathers around its neck were permanently bent backward. Thin scars crossed one talon, as though another monster had nearly torn the foot away years earlier. The monster became clearer because it was getting closer. He measured the distance carefully. Each dream reduced the space between them. 30 paces. 20. 10. 5. He wrote those numbers repeatedly until they filled nearly an entire page. Sleep became impossible. Whenever exhaustion finally forced his eyes closed, the dreams resumed instantly without transition. There was no comforting period of unconsciousness. One moment he lay in bed. The next he stood before the same moonlit forest, while the malformed Malfestio waited a few steps nearer than before. The observer tried injuring himself to remain awake. He carved shallow cuts into his forearm. He brewed herbs strong enough to make his heart race painfully. He tied cords around his wrists, connected to bells that would ring if he slumped forward. Nothing worked. The human body always demands payment for stolen sleep. Eventually, it collected. The final coherent journal entry described something no hunter should ever experience. He stood within the dream while the Preyseeker landed directly before him. Its wings folded with unnatural silence. No wind stirred, despite their enormous size. The creature stared without aggression, without haste, displaying the absolute confidence of a predator approaching an animal too exhausted to flee. Then it spoke. Not with words, its beak never moved. Instead, the observer heard his own voice from somewhere behind him calmly whisper, "Wake up." He obeyed. He opened his eyes inside the cabin. Morning light entered through the window. The nightmare had ended. Relief lasted only long enough for him to notice muddy footprints crossing the wooden floor. They began beside the bed. They ended at the bedroom door. Nothing should have been able to enter. Nothing should have been able to leave. Yet scattered across the blanket lay several black feathers, still damp with mountain droplets. From that point onward, the handwriting became nearly unreadable. Entire paragraphs wandered across the page without punctuation. Some lines were scratched out so violently the quill tore through the paper. The same sentence appeared over and over again. "It is learning how to wake up with me." The recovery team estimated another 3 days passed before they reached the cabin. No one knows what happened during those final nights. Only the last completed page survived intact. The final entry was written with remarkable steadiness compared to everything preceding it. The observer claimed he understood the purpose of the nightmares at last. They had never been attacks. They had been introductions. Every dream familiarized his mind with the creature's appearance, its movements, the sound of its wings, until seeing the monster no longer shocked him awake. Exhaustion blurred the boundary separating nightmare from reality, allowing something that belonged to one world to step quietly into the other. He wrote that he intended to remain awake until help arrived. He apologized to whoever eventually found the journal. He asked them not to sleep inside the cabin. The final paragraph ended with a simple description. He had been awake. He was certain of it. The lantern was burning. The room was silent. Then he heard soft claws land upon the wooden floor behind his bed. He refused to turn around. Instead, he stared at the opposite wall, where a shadow slowly spread upward, not cast by the lantern, but by something standing directly behind him. He wrote one final sentence. I finally understand why it never attacked inside the dream. The sentence stopped there. No official guild report acknowledges the existence of a Preyseeker Malfestio. Every recovered document attributes the incident to stress, isolation, and catastrophic sleep deprivation. On paper, the mystery ends with an exhausted observer suffering hallucinations before disappearing into the wilderness. Perhaps that explanation is correct. Sleep deprivation can produce terrifying visions. It can distort memory, perception, and reason until the impossible feels ordinary. Any experienced hunter knows the mind can become its own worst enemy after enough sleepless nights. But if you ever find yourself waking more exhausted than when you fell asleep, if the same dream waits for you every single night, exactly where it ended before, and if an owl-shaped silhouette grows just a little clearer each time you see it, do not convince yourself that rest will solve the problem. Some predators are patient enough to let you believe that, because according to the forgotten journals, the final night is always the easiest one to recognize. It is the first morning you wake completely certain the nightmare is over. And then you notice there is something standing quietly in the corner of your room, watching with unblinking golden eyes, waiting for you to make the mistake of believing you are truly awake.
This report remains under investigation. The Guild closed this case. The archives did not.